The Vietnam War is back in the news. It's still a war that to this day, there's a lot of controversy around why the United States entered into it. What is your perspective on that?
The United States went to war in Vietnam for multiple reasons, but the basic reason was Charles de Gaulle. The American strategy at the time was to contain the Soviet Union with a string of alliances, swinging from Norway all the way through Iran, and block them from expanding. Charles de Gaulle came along and said, you can't trust the Americans, because if they ever attacked, the Americans wouldn't come, and they were not going to go to fight for you. You're going to be left alone. We have to form our own NATO independent of the United States. During the Vietnam War, there's a word that became incredibly important: credibility. Credibility meant that how credible were the American guarantees to this all-important structure of containment? How credible was it that we would come to Germany's aid or Japan's aid with everything we had if there were war? And the terrible fear at that time was that these people would lose confidence in us. So part of the reason we went to Vietnam had nothing to do with Vietnam. The fear was that if we didn't go to Vietnam, our credibility with our other allies would be gone, and the entire American strategy would collapse. On that basis, there was no expectation we'd wind up with 50,000 dead. On that basis, the expectation was that we would go into a small police action. We may win it, we may lose it, but the Germans would know that our guarantee means something. And to a very great extent, in my opinion, worrying about how the Europeans would react if we didn't go in was important. Now, the fact was that the Europeans criticized the United States for going in. But if we hadn't gone in, they would have really panicked. They would have really potentially said, is NATO worth anything? Is Japan's guarantees worth anything? And so we went in based on something that was repeated over and over again: credibility. It's really hard to be a superpower, because it's one thing to fight for your life in World War II. But to go to war for an abstract political consideration having to do with strategy elsewhere, and send your kids to fight in a war like that, is agonizing, particularly when you're thinking this war is about winning in Vietnam, and it really isn't. So we look at the war and we wonder, why did we fight this war this way, half-heartedly, not seriously? Well, and it got out of hand, but the reason basically was this was a political war. It had as its end not protecting Vietnam from the communists. That was important. It was a side issue. It had to do with maintaining the entire American alliance structure and keeping the Soviets from using this as a basis for unraveling our position.
Okay, so framed within that context, when I ask you a very interesting question, you know that to this day there's a lot of controversy about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. What's your analysis of what actually happened there?
Whatever happened there, the United States had made the decision to conduct an air war against North Vietnam. We knew that if we went in on the ground, we'd be fighting a land war in Asia, which Douglas MacArthur had warned us against. Our illusion was that we would use air power to inflict so much pain on the North Vietnamese that they would give up the dream of national unification. Well, that didn't happen. In fact, they picked up the air operations in South Vietnam, which meant we had to send more troops and more troops and more troops. But the Gulf of Tonkin was very convenient. There are some who say that we provoked it. There are some who say the Vietnamese attacked a bunch of patrol boats against an American fleet. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's some people who said we just made it up. Either way, that was the propaganda aspect of it, the justification. We had made a decision to demonstrate to our allies that we were prepared to go to war on behalf of another ally, even if it was dumb.
So ultimately, Richard Nixon was the one that ended the war on behalf of the United States. What did Nixon understand about Vietnam that LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, maybe didn't, or wasn't able to grasp at that time?
LBJ had Robert McNamara. And Robert McNamara read the Cuban Missile Crisis as a triumph of careful, articulated escalation. It wasn't. When the Russians realized that the United States was in DEFCON 3, they realized it was one way or the other, and they didn't have a major nuclear option at the time. And so they backed off. In McNamara's mind, Vietnam was another case of crisis management. And the word is slowly increasing the pain. Well, the problem with slowly increasing the pain is you get used to the pain, and you're not influenced by that. And this is what McNamara just didn't grasp. For him, it was a mathematical model. He didn't understand, well, we call it shock and awe, I guess, but he really had to convince the North Vietnamese. And the problem is that slow escalation simply convinced the North Vietnamese we didn't have stomach for the war. Nixon comes along, and he does something nobody else did. He invades Cambodia. Now everybody says the secret war in Cambodia. Well, it wasn't secret to the Cambodians. It wasn't secret to us. I don't know who it was secret to. He went ahead to extended attacks on the Vietnamese headquarters, which they had placed in Cambodia. That didn't work. In the end, the peace came through an operation of B-52s bombing Hanoi. At that point, finally, the Vietnamese realized we at least have to sign a separate treaty. We can't take this pain. But he had another trick up his sleeve. Early on in his administration, he decided that there was fighting going on between the Chinese and the Russians on the Ussuri River. And he was going to ally with the Chinese. Now, this had huge consequences for the Vietnamese, because if China was allying, working with the United States, well, goodness, we've got ourselves a problem. And so what he did was twofold. First, he moved the war from careful escalation to stunning, or trying to stun, the North Vietnamese. And second, he conducted a geopolitical maneuver of the most brilliant sort. Not primarily for the Vietnam War, but because the Chinese needed an ally against the Russians. He reached out to them, and suddenly the Vietnamese felt quite isolated. In the end, particularly after the fall of Richard Nixon, and the fact that the United States was really sick of this war, quite properly, the Vietnamese decided it was time to move. Interestingly enough, later in that decade, Vietnam and China fought a war, which the Chinese won, which the Vietnamese won, the Chinese lost. So when you look at all this, okay, what Johnson did was think that this was a simple matter of showing our will. And what Nixon did was complicated beyond belief. Got us out without NATO falling apart. Built a relationship with China that, is not quite the same today, but it was critical. And, set the groundwork for modern American policy in Asia. But the difference was that Lyndon Johnson really didn't understand the world. And Richard Nixon didn't understand the United States. But he got the world.
Okay, final question for you then on this issue. Has the political class in the United States come to grips with or learned the lessons of the Vietnam War yet?
Well, the political class in the United States are the voters. And as much as we like to think that some clown in Washington, he's only there because the voters put him there. And did they come to terms with it? No. The basic lesson that we have is divided in half. This is a sign that the United States should not get involved in such activities, to another class which basically says if we get involved, we should use overwhelming, stunning, catastrophic force. Interestingly now, the right wing has come over to the left wing's point of view, which is we ought to be doing this. And the left wing is saying, oh my God, we can't leave those poor Libyans. So the charm of American politics is that everybody changes his mind. My favorite is the manner in which the Democratic Party, which is always a party of détente, now are bitterly opposed to any talks with the Russians. Or, in fact, amusingly, the hint that a president might have a talk with a foreign power is outrageous, despite the fact Obama went to Germany. So I love the American political class. It's us.
Thank you so much for your time, George.
Thank you.